This is a mighty serious video on global climate change, a short-term retrospect on the United Nations Conference of the Parties, COP26. I'm Peter Carter, making the video in November 21, and the question has arisen, is COP26 a crime against humanity, or is it a significant part of a crime against humanity? The question arises because of a charge against COP26 by Extinction Rebellion. And this is from their website, their quote from their website: "The ever-worsening climate and ecological emergency is a crime against humanity, perpetrated by the rich and powerful against the poor and vulnerable. Our actions must charge the world's most powerful governments with mass manslaughter by gross negligence. The COP process is systematically corrupted by vested interests. It only serves injustice and failure. COP26 is the next chapter in a story of broken promises, reckless greed, and unbelievable failure that stretches all the way back to COP1. And 25 of these COP meetings, and now 26, have failed to prevent us heading for catastrophe as emissions continue to rise." To quote the Executive Secretary for the United Nations Climate Change Convention, Patricia Espinosa, her quote at the final day of the conference, and she made a similar quote on the first day, which is important, and what she said was, "What was at stake is the long-term survival of the human race." So, of course, I have to provide just a little background science of our current situation. Using this one graphic record, I can show you how serious the climate change emergency is and how everything is accelerating. It's getting worse faster. This shows the global warming index from Oxford University, and this is the global warming caused by human emissions alone. The orange line here, and clearly that's accelerating from 1860, and it's accelerating very recently. The last update was the 15th of December 2020, with the global warming index 1.2 degrees C. In green, alongside it, there's a clearly constantly accelerating cumulative CO2 emissions. Cumulative CO2 emissions is the climate change indicator used by the scientists for calculating mitigation requirements, etc. And there was a paper published on this in August of 2020 showing that the cumulative CO2 emissions is tracking the very worst case scenario. That's RCP 8.5. In green, alongside it, there's a clearly constantly accelerating cumulative CO2 emissions. Cumulative CO2 emissions is the climate change indicator used by the scientists for calculating mitigation requirements, etc. And there was a paper published on this in August of 2020 showing that the cumulative CO2 emissions is tracking the very worst case scenario. That's RCP 8.5. The world economy is continuing to keep the world fixed on the worst case scenario. This is the latest report from the Global Carbon Project. That's the authoritative annual source of fossil fuel CO2 emissions. The quote from the report is that global fossil fuel CO2 emissions have risen steadily over the last decades. Emissions in 2021 are set to rebound towards their pre-COVID-19 levels after an unprecedented drop in 2020. So back to the crime against humanity. I think the evidence is overwhelming. The COP26 Glasgow Pact is in itself proof of crimes against humanity by world powers. One thing that tends to get missed out, which is a very definite proof of crimes against humanity, is the fact that combustion of fossil fuels emits greenhouse gas emissions, mainly CO2, but now a very large amount of methane, due to the increase in the natural gas industry, natural gas being mainly methane, but it also, and we've known this for like 100 years, it also emits toxic air pollution. This is the latest research on that, published in April 2021, and this shows that over 10 million people a year are dying from fossil fuel air pollution. So there's the details of the study. And this is even worse because global warming causes this air pollution to increase. So this is from the media, from CNBC. The headline, "Still on the Road to Hell. Global Media Reacts to COP26 Climate Deal." That is not hyperbole, as I'll show. In his speech at COP26 in the opening plenary, the IPCC chair, Dr. Hussein Lee, stated the following: "Global warming of 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C will be exceeded during this century unless immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, especially of carbon dioxide and methane, occur in the nearest future." Here we're looking at the very first draft of what was supposed to be an agreement to do something about catastrophic global climate change. It's titled Draft COP Decision Proposed by the President. Now, you'll see down here in item 19, it says fossil fuels. Well, everybody got very excited about this because this was the very first time in a COP, and the COPs have been going on for 26 years, that fossil fuels was actually mentioned in a draft agreement or any form of an agreement. So, but it starts off with no commitments and no actions whatsoever. Reaffirms, also recognizes, invites parties, calls upon parties, emphasizes. So, absolutely no commitment, absolutely no action whatsoever in the original draft text, which is supposedly just proposals. And here's the significant text that, as I say, was adulterated to make it meaningless. So the original text was calls upon parties to accelerate the phasing out of coal and subsidies for fossil fuels. And it's down here on item 19. And so now we come to the final day of the conference, the COP26, and the final document, which was called the Glasgow Climate Pact, the Glasgow Pact. So here is the Glasgow Pact. There's the official designation, and this is the section on mitigation, that is on emissions. The fact that there was absolutely no commitments and absolutely no actions on the original draft at the start of the conference, this hasn't changed. This is just a sort of information list. Look, there are 7 clauses here. Reaffirms, recognizes, also recognizes, further recognizes, invites, calls upon, emphasizes. Nothing towards a commitment or towards any actions. And so we come to the last minute neutralizing of the coal and the fossil fuel subsidies in the COP26 final clause. And that clause is 20, and I've just edited this right down for the coal and the fossil fuel subsidies. So, as I already said, calls upon parties, that's no commitment, it's no action, to accelerate efforts towards the phase down, not the phase out, of unabated has been inserted, coal power, and the phase out of inefficient has been inserted, fossil fuel subsidies. Now you'll see this language over and over, avoids any commitment, avoids doing anything, to accelerate, increase, whatever that is, because it's not happening anyway, efforts No, we want action, not efforts. Towards, no, we need action now. So it goes on. It's made completely useless. So what is unabated coal power and what is inefficient fossil fuel subsidies? Unabated coal. So what we can say is that this is not an unconditional end of coal, and it is not an end of coal at any time. The best definition of sorts I could find was coal power that is not mitigated with technologies to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So reducing carbon dioxide emissions from coal does not mean ending coal. That means you can continue burning coal. And mitigated with technologies, well, I guess that could mean anything that might slightly reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide. So all of this language over and over says that there's no intention to stop burning coal. And so to inefficient. Inefficient, that again is not an unconditional end to fossil fuel subsidies, nor is it an end at any time. And so it's another delay. And we've been having delays of action, as I've said, at least since 1995, when the United Nations Climate Convention had been ratified for several years. As far as I could find, the unconditional term comes from a G20 summit in Pittsburgh statement that goes right back to 2009. And that is definitely not defined. I found experts in economics and in energy that said no, not defined. The International Energy Agency says it's a subsidy that encourages wasteful consumption. This again could mean anything. It certainly doesn't mean a definite end of fossil fuel subsidies. Perhaps the most important thing is what it doesn't say. It doesn't say the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies that encourage pollution. It doesn't say the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies so as to stop air pollution, nor does it say so as to stop greenhouse gas pollution in the atmosphere. In other words, these do not have to be accounted. They do not have to be the basis or the reason for phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. The obvious unprecedented evil, certainly today, of giving public money in vast amounts as fossil fuel subsidies. The last complete total estimate of all fossil fuel subsidies and financial incentives by the International Monetary Fund found that subsidies had increased to the fossil fuel industry to the tune of almost $6 trillion a year. $5.9 trillion of public money given by their governments to the fossil fuel industry. This is an unimaginable magnitude crime, for sure a crime against humanity. By any normative standard of ethics or morality, the COP26 Glasgow Pact is an unprecedented evil, allowing the killing by the fossil fuel industry of 10.2 million people a year to be ignored and to continue. And the continued global surface heating of the Glasgow Pact will increase the air pollution and the deaths. It is an unprecedented crime against all humanity and all life on Earth, because it allows and commits the global temperature increase to exceed 2 degrees C. It allows fossil fuel business as usual to continue, which leads to a surface temperature increase of at least 2.7 degrees C this century. And that means hot-house Earth and runaway global heating, climate chaos. It is an insanely evil end-of-the-world pact, sacrificing the survival of the human race and life on Earth to the fossil fuel industry and the big investment banks that finance more fossil fuel extraction.